Some writers describe the world. Dostoevsky described the soul. Not the polished soul of ideals and virtues, not the public version of the self-disciplined, coherent, presentable, but the real one. The soul you feel in silence, the one that trembles, the one that hides, the one that knows exactly what it's capable of and prays no one ever sees it. Dostoevsky did. He looked directly into that place, into the anger you suppress, the guilt you avoid, the shame you carry, the quiet urge to sabotage your own life, simply to feel something. He didn't turn away, he walked in. And that's why his work is still alive, not just relevant, but dangerous. Because Dostoevsky did not write to entertain you, he wrote to confront you. He holds up a mirror, not to your beauty, not to your intelligence, but to your contradictions. The part of you that wants to be good and sometimes chooses otherwise. The part that loves deeply and wounds without meaning to. The part that wants to be seen and fears exposure at the same time. He knew this duality wasn't rare. It was human. It was you. And this is why reading Dostoevsky is often uncomfortable. Because he strips you of excuses. He doesn't let you hide behind modern language or social explanations. He reaches beneath them into the primitive, the spiritual, the personal. He shows you to yourself not to punish, but to awaken. Because you cannot heal what you refuse to see. You cannot change what you will not name. In Notes from Underground, he gave voice to the self-loathing cynic that lives beneath the surface. In Crime and Punishment, he painted the quiet unraveling of a man who convinced himself he was above guilt. In The Brothers Karamazov, he staged a courtroom of the soul where love, faith, rage, and despair all took turns speaking. These weren't characters, they were fragments of us. Dostoevsky wasn't inventing madness. He was transcribing it. He was saying, look, this lives in you too, and if you pretend it doesn't, it will own you. Most people spend their lives running from themselves, from their darkness, from their rage, from the parts that don't align with who they think they are. Dostoevsky didn't run. He listened. He asked, why is this here? What is it trying to say? What would happen if you faced it? He knew the mind isn't a clean, logical machine. It's a battlefield of memory and impulse, desire and guilt, cruelty and love. And he knew more than anyone that real self-knowledge doesn't come from success. It comes from collapse, from betrayal, from staring into the abyss and not looking away. That's why his writing matters. Because it doesn't show you who you should be. It shows you who you are. And that is the first step toward becoming someone real. There's a quiet hunger most people carry. They never speak of it. They rarely let themselves feel it. But it's there, underneath the politeness, beneath the routines, behind the carefully managed life. A desire to destroy something, not out of malice, not because they're evil, but because part of them believes that only through collapse can something real be born. Dostoevsky saw this hunger clearly. He didn't write about crime as a deviation. He wrote about it as a symptom, a sign that something deeper in the human soul was breaking under the weight of invisible pressure. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov doesn't kill for money. He doesn't kill out of hatred. He kills because he's trying to test a theory that some people are above morality, that some lives matter more than others, that there is a kind of freedom that can be reached by stepping over a line no one dares cross. But Dostoevsky shows us the truth. The moment Raskolnikov crosses that line, he doesn't feel freedom, he feels nothing. And that nothingness is worse than guilt, worse than punishment. It is the collapse of self. Because beneath the crime was not a philosophy, It was pain. It was fear. It was the desperate desire to feel something true in a world of unbearable contradiction. Dostoevsky wasn't interested in laws. He was interested in conscience. He asked, what happens to a person who tries to live without one? What happens when logic replaces soul? What happens when the mind rebels against the heart? Raskolnikov isn't a monster. He is someone you understand more than you'd like to admit. Because there are days when you wish you could escape your own morality, when you fantasize about being someone else, someone untouched by guilt, by shame, by consequence. Not because you're cruel, but because morality, in a world that feels meaningless, can become a cage. And sometimes we want to break the bars just to feel again. Dostoevsky knew this. He wrote not to justify it, but to expose it. To say, you are not alone in your contradiction. You are not wrong for having violent thoughts, dark urges, irrational desires. You are human. And part of being human is being dangerous. Not outwardly, but inwardly. To your own peace, to your own story, to the fragile image of yourself you try so hard to protect. Dostoevsky's brilliance was not in showing you the killer. It was in showing you the voice before the act, the whisper that says, what if you just destroyed it all? What if you let it burn? What if you stopped pretending? And the truth is, most people have heard that voice, even if only once, even if only faintly. And that is why his books don't feel like fiction. They feel like memory, like recognition, like someone finally wrote down what you've never dared to say out loud. Because Dostoevsky wasn't telling a story. He was translating a fracture. The fracture between the person you are and the person you're afraid you might become. He sits alone beneath the surface. No friends, no goals, no illusions, just thought. But thought twisted inward, turned against itself. Like a blade sharpened too long, now cutting its own handle. He is the underground man. And if you've ever felt tired of meaning, allergic to positivity, disgusted by your own feelings, you've met him. He is not a villain. He is not mad. He is you when your soul refuses to play along. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground is not a novel. It is a confession, a warning, a prophecy. It's the voice of someone who has rejected the world not because it is too dark, but because it pretends to be too bright. The underground man knows every argument, every philosophical ideal, every rational explanation. And he tears them apart, not because they're false, but because they're insufficient, too clean, too confident, too proud. He rebels against the very idea of coherence, because deep down, he suspects that no human being is ever really coherent, that we are made of contradictions, urges, fears, and fragments we barely understand. He mocks the idea that we are rational creatures. He says, we're not computers, we are chaos. And Dostoevsky lets him speak. He doesn't silence him. He doesn't resolve him. He lets the brokenness exist raw, bitter, alive. Because he understood something most philosophers didn't. That the darkest part of you doesn't want clarity, it wants honesty. And honesty means admitting that sometimes you don't want to be better. You don't want to grow. You don't want to believe. Sometimes you want to resist your own healing. You want to ruin things just to prove you're still free. You want to contradict yourself not because you're confused, but because the world's answers feel too small for your pain. This is the rebellion of the underground. It is not a rebellion of fire. It is a rebellion of silence, of refusal, of saying, I see your systems, and I choose none of them. Dostoevsky didn't offer a solution to this rebellion, because it's not a problem to be solved. It's a stage, a moment in the soul's journey, when meaning breaks down, so that something more honest can emerge. If you've ever sat in the dark and wanted nothing, not love, not truth, not hope, you have been in the underground. And if you've found your way back, you know why Dostoevsky let you visit. Not to stay there, but to know that part of you exists, and to stop fearing it. Because even the most fractured soul, even the most bitter voice, even the one who spits on beauty and mocks belief, still wants to be known. And Dostoevsky knew that the only way out of the underground is through it. There is a moment in the Brothers Karamazov, unlike anything else in literature. It is not action. It is not spectacle. It is a conversation between a man and the devil. But this devil doesn't arrive with horns or smoke. He isn't terrifying. He's irritating, sarcastic, annoyingly familiar. Because he sounds just like you. This is Dostoevsky's genius. The devil appears not as some external force, but as the internal voice we all try to ignore. The whispering cynic, the clever underminer, the voice that mocks your hope, poisons your faith, and never truly disappears. Ivan Karamazov, brilliant, tormented, angry, is the one who meets him, not in a church, not in a nightmare, but in his own mind. And that's where Dostoevsky makes his move. He tells us, the greatest battles do not happen in the world. They happen in the space between your thoughts, in the private room of your own beliefs. And the devil, he doesn't threaten, he questions. He doesn't destroy, he doubts. He turns every ideal on its head. He takes your values and flips them, until what once gave you meaning now feels absurd. Why love if it always ends in loss? Why forgive when revenge feels more honest? Why believe in God when innocent children suffer? Ivan can't answer, and neither can you. Because these are not questions of intellect, they're wounds. Dostoevsky knew that doubt isn't a weakness of logic. It's the language of pain. When the soul is hurt deeply enough, it starts to ask, why? Not to learn, but to bleed. And so Ivan spirals, not because the devil is powerful, but because he is inside. Because part of Ivan wants to lose the argument. Part of him wants to surrender to the darkness, to give up the burden of belief and simply collapse. And yet he fights. Not perfectly, not heroically, but sincerely. This is what Dostoevsky understood better than anyone, that the devil isn't a monster in the dark. He's the part of you that has seen too much, felt too much, lost too much. He's the one who comes not to tempt, but to ask, are you sure this world deserves your love? And the truth? You don't always know. Sometimes you don't love the world. Sometimes you want it to burn. Sometimes even your highest values feel like lies. Dostoevsky didn't flinch at this. He wrote it. Because he knew if you can face your devil and not look away, if you can stay in the room when that voice begins to speak, if you can hold your ground without pretending to be pure, then something changes. You don't silence the devil, you transcend him. You don't escape the darkness, you include it in your understanding of yourself. Because only the person who has stood beside their own worst thoughts can ever truly say, I am real. We've been taught to fear the darkness inside us, to treat it like an infection, something to cut out, to cleanse, to exile, as if the only way to be good is to erase everything that isn't. But Dostoevsky knew better. He didn't fear the dark. He listened to it. Because he understood something most people never dare to ask. What if your darkness isn't evil? What if it's the part of you that hasn't been understood yet? In the modern world, we're obsessed with image, with performance, with being seen as whole, balanced, enlightened. But inside, most of us are at war. A quiet war. One where we punish ourselves for feeling what we feel, where we shame ourselves for our anger, our desire, our sadness, our envy, our cynicism. We wear smiles like armor. We speak softly even when we want to scream. We try to be light even when we're drowning in shadows. But Dostoevsky didn't want you to be light. He wanted you to be honest. He wanted you to walk into the darkest room of your soul and see that it's not filled with monsters, it's filled with you. The version of you who never got to speak. The one who was told to be quiet. The one who was blamed for being too intense, too emotional, too much. And most of all, the one who was never given love. Not conditional love, not transactional love, but the kind of love that says, I see all of you and I stay. This is what Dostoevsky offered. Not judgment, not diagnosis, but compassion for the fragmented self. Because your darkness is not something to fix. It's something to witness, to understand, to include. The person who has never faced their own shadow is not innocent. They're incomplete. They will judge others quickly. They will run from discomfort. They will moralize without insight. They will mistake performance for character. But the person who has sat with their pain, who has looked at their contradictions without flinching, who has dared to say, yes, this lives in me too, that person is free. Not perfect, but free. Dostoevsky wasn't trying to make you feel guilty. He was trying to liberate you. Because once you stop hiding from yourself, no one can use your flaws against you. Once you stop pretending to be pure, you become real. And real people, not saints, not angels, are the only ones who can actually love. Because they've loved themselves at their lowest and still chose to stay. Dostoevsky never wrote about saints. He wrote about the condemned, the criminals, the addicts, the liars, the broken-hearted and God-haunted. And he loved them, not in a sentimental way, not with pity, but with a terrifying, unwavering compassion, the kind that sees every sin, every weakness, every disgrace, and still stays. He didn't believe that only the good deserved redemption. He believed that the soul is most visible when it has nothing left to hide, when it's been stripped of all excuses, when it falls to its knees and says, I don't know who I am anymore. That's where Dostoevsky went, right into that moment. He didn't judge the fallen. He sat beside them, because he knew the people who look most lost are often the ones who've seen the most truth, and it broke them. This is what modern culture forgets. We're so obsessed with image, with moral purity, with performative ethics, that we forget what it means to actually see someone, to look at their mess, to hear the contradiction in their voice, to feel the violence in their heart, and not recoil, but lean in. Dostoevsky's compassion wasn't blind, it was brutal in its clarity. He saw people exactly as they were and still wrote them with tenderness. Because he understood that pain doesn't always make you kind, that trauma doesn't always make you soft, that suffering doesn't always make you holy. Sometimes it makes you cruel, sometimes it makes you lie, sometimes it makes you destroy the very things you love. But even in that, he saw the sacred. Because to fall that far and still feel the ache of conscience is a kind of miracle. He didn't romanticize darkness, but he didn't exile it either. He believed that the soul finds its depth not through triumph, but through collapse. And what mattered to him was not whether you sinned, but whether you felt it, whether you could look at the ruin and still whisper, "God, have mercy." Not because you believed in God, but because you hoped someone, anyone, could still love you after everything. Dostoevsky believed that someone could, and in his writing, that someone was often him. He carried the damned in his arms, not to lift them out, but to say, "Even here you are not alone." That is the kind of compassion that heals, the kind that doesn't flinch, the kind that meets you at your lowest point and offers no lecture, only presence. Because sometimes being understood is the closest thing to salvation you'll ever get. You don't become real through perfection. You don't find yourself at the top of the mountain, shining and whole. You find yourself in the dark, when nothing makes sense, when everything you thought you were begins to unravel. This is where Dostoevsky lived, not in the clean conclusion, but in the tension, in the collapse, in the contradiction. He knew that the journey into the soul doesn't lead upward, it leads down, into guilt, into madness, into broken beliefs and fractured love, into the terrifying moment when you realize you don't know who you are anymore. That's when it begins. Not the end, the beginning. Because only when the false self falls apart can the real self begin to take shape. The self that doesn't need approval, the self that doesn't perform virtue, the self that bleeds and still believes, the self that doubts and still dares, the self that knows exactly how dark it can become and chooses not to live in denial. This is why Dostoevsky's characters feel alive. They are not ideas, they are wrestlers of the soul, always torn, always reaching, always breaking, and somehow still breathing. He didn't promise redemption. He promised the possibility of it, but only for those who are willing to descend, to walk through the underground, to face the devil, to feel the crime and the punishment, to see the broken mirror and not look away. You don't become real by escaping darkness. You become real by including it, by holding your fear in one hand and your longing in the other and walking forward anyway. That's what Dostoevsky gave us. Not a way out, but a way in. Not a clean doctrine, but a mirror. A terrifying, sacred mirror that reflects the parts of you that you tried to exile. And in doing so, it calls you home. To the self that has failed, to the self that has lied, to the self that has fallen so many times it no longer pretends to fly, but still stands, still walks, still loves, still writes its name into the world. Not with pride, but with truth. Because the one who has been through the dark and chosen to stay awake is the one who finally understands. To be human is to carry the shadow without letting it own you. And that is not weakness, that is strength. That is not despair, that is honesty. That is not failure, that is freedom. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Dostoevsky saw in you before you ever saw it in yourself.